The Story 1. The Night Shift at the Abandoned Hospital. It started out like any other ordinary night. If someone had told me I'd never view the world the same way after that shift, I would have laughed in their face. But that's the thing about life. You never know when you're about to walk into the shadows. I used to work security, mostly the boring kind where you sit in front of a dozen monitors and sip coffee until your shift ends. The kind where nothing happens. The money was decent and I didn't mind the solitude. It gave me time to think, sometimes too much time. But this particular job, this one was different. They called me in for a temp gig at an old abandoned hospital on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Jefferson Medical had been closed down for nearly 20 years. There were rumors about why, but most of them were just urban legends. Kids snuck in all the time, vandalizing the place or doing what teenagers do in forgotten buildings. It was my job to keep them out for a week while the city prepared to demolish the place. I arrived just after sunset, pulling up in my beat-up truck, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that seemed to always linger around that area. The hospital stood there like a corpse in the mist, its windows broken, the walls cracked and overgrown with vines. There was something about it that instantly put me on edge, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way the building loomed over me, or maybe it was the stories I'd heard about strange things happening inside. The first few hours passed without incident. I walked the perimeter, shining my flashlight into every corner, every darkened hallway. The place was a labyrinth, with long corridors and stairwells that seemed to spiral into nothing. It was eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the building settling. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, but deep down, something felt off. By midnight, I had settled into the old security room, flipping through the channels on my phone, half watching the dim monitors that showed various parts of the hospital. I wasn't expecting anything to happen. The building was supposed to be empty, after all. And that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a glitch. One of the monitors, the one showing the north wing, flickered. Static. It happened sometimes, no big deal. But then, just as the image came back, I saw a figure. It was faint, like a shadow, just standing there in the middle of the hallway. My heart jumped into my throat. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen. The figure was gone. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe I was just tired. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the clock. 1:03 a.m. The next few minutes were uneventful, and I began to relax. I told myself I was just jumpy because of the creepy atmosphere. But then the radio crackled. "Help, please." It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but there it was, a voice on the other end of my walkie-talkie. I froze, staring at the device like it had just come to life on its own. No one else was supposed to be here. It was a closed channel. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice shaky. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the hallway, telling myself it was probably just some kids who had broken in. But as I walked, the hospital seemed to close in around me. The air grew thick, and the silence was oppressive. I swept my flashlight across the hallways, checking every door, every shadow. Nothing. But as I turned the corner into the north wing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure from the monitor was standing there at the far end of the hall. This time, I could see it more clearly. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, wearing what appeared to be an old hospital gown. His back was to me, his head slightly tilted as if he was listening for something. I swallowed hard, raising my flashlight. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here," my voice echoed down the hall, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there silent and still. I took a few steps forward, and the lights above me flickered. The closer I got, the colder it became, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. I could see my breath now, fogging up the air in front of me. My skin prickled with goosebumps. When I was about 20 feet away, the figure slowly turned its head, and that's when I saw it, the face. or rather, the lack of one. It was as if someone had wiped away every feature, leaving behind a smooth, blank surface. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I bolted back to the security room, my hands trembling as I slammed the door shut behind me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe I was a trick of the light, or maybe I was hallucinating, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I sat there in silence, staring at the monitors, waiting for something to happen, and then it did. The radio crackled to life again. "Help! They're coming!" This time, the voice was louder, more urgent. I grabbed the walkie-talkie, my voice trembling. "Who is this? Where are you?" "The basement. They're in the basement." My stomach turned. The basement was supposed to be sealed off. There hadn't been access to it in years. But now, there was no denying it. Someone or something was down there. I stood up, my legs shaking, and made my way toward the stairwell. The hospital seemed darker now, more ominous, as if it was alive, breathing around me. Every step echoed through the empty halls, the sound of my boots like gunshots in the silence. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. The air was thick with dust, and the handle was cold, like it hadn't been touched in decades. I twisted it slowly, the creak of the hinges sending shivers down my spine. The stairs led down into the blackness, the only light coming from the dim bulb above me. I descended carefully, my flashlight cutting through the thick shadows. The further I went, the colder it became. The walls were damp, the air stale and suffocating. At the bottom, there was a long, narrow hallway with doors on either side. Most were sealed shut, but a few were slightly ajar. As I moved forward, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The doors were marked with patient numbers, and they were all scratched out. My heart pounded in my chest as I continued down the hall, my footsteps echoing off the cold, concrete walls. The radio crackled again. "They're here." The voice was right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was no one there. My breath came in ragged gasps, the panic rising in my throat. I turned back toward the end of the hall, but something had changed. There, standing in front of the last door, was the figure. It was closer now, its featureless face staring at me, though it had no eyes. I froze, unable to move, as it slowly raised its hand and pointed toward the door. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run, but something compelled me to step forward. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, the kind that made it hard to breathe. The door creaked open, revealing a small room. Inside, the walls were lined with old medical equipment, dusty and forgotten, but in the center of the room, there was something that made my blood run cold. It was a bed, and lying on it was a body, or what was left of one. The figure on the bed was skeletal. Its skin stretched thin over its bones, as if it had been there for decades. And then, slowly, its head turned toward me. The radio crackled once more. You can't leave." I stumbled back, my heart racing as the figure on the bed slowly sat up. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were empty sockets, dark and hollow, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the basement or how I got back to my truck. The next thing I knew, I was speeding down the road, the hospital shrinking in the rearview mirror. I never went back to Jefferson Medical. A few days later, I learned that the hospital had been demolished, and with it, any trace of what had happened that night. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the crackle of the radio and the voice whispering in the darkness. "You can't leave." And deep down, I know that maybe I never really did. The Story 2, The Shivering Path. It's funny how the most ordinary things can hide the deepest horrors. You walk by them every day, never imagining the secrets that could be lurking just out of sight. For me, that thing was a path, a simple, forgotten trail I used to take to school when I was a kid. If only I had known then what I know now. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, not far from Pittsburgh. It was one of those towns where everybody knows everybody, where nothing ever happens except for high school football games and the occasional town fair. Growing up, we didn't have much, but we had enough. A modest house, a close-knit family, and a dog named Baxter who used to chase squirrels across our backyard. I was an average kid, quiet, kept to myself, loved reading scary stories but was too afraid to watch horror movies. My school was about a 15-minute walk from home. There was a direct route down Maple Street, but when I was about 10, I discovered a path that cut through the woods. It was narrow and slightly overgrown, but it shaved 5 minutes off my walk and gave me a strange sense of adventure. I called it the Shivering Path, though I couldn't tell you why. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to tremble in the wind, or the way the shadows shifted just out of view. I used that path almost every day, and nothing ever happened. Not until I was much older, anyway. It wasn't until I was 26, long after I had left town for college and a job in the city, that I found myself back on that path. My mother had fallen ill, and I had returned home to help care for her. The house was just as I remembered it, though it felt smaller, quieter. My father had passed away a few years earlier, and without him, the house seemed to sag with an invisible weight. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult day with my mom, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my feet carried me toward the school, and before I knew it, I was standing at the entrance of the Shivering Path. It looked just as it had when I was a kid. Narrow, winding, the trees casting long shadows over the dirt trail. Without thinking, I stepped onto the path and began walking. The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt a strange sense of nostalgia as I walked, remembering the times I had raced down this very path, pretending I was an explorer in some distant jungle. But as I continued, something felt off. The air seemed colder than it should have been for a summer afternoon, and the shadows seemed darker, almost like they were moving. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the path, just where the trail curved out of sight. At first, I thought it was just another person out for a walk, but as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. He was too still. His back was to me, and he was wearing old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the 1940s. A long trench coat, a hat pulled low over his face. I stopped in my tracks, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around and walk away. But something about him drew me in. I called out to him, "Hey, are you okay?" He didn't move. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you need help?" No response. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, he turned his head ever so slightly, just enough for me to see the side of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, his eyes were wrong. They were sunken, hollow, like there was nothing behind them. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me with those dead eyes. I turned and ran, sprinting down the path as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't stop until I was back on Maple Street, the familiar houses and cars grounding me in reality. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. It seemed too ridiculous, too impossible. But the image of that man haunted me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I tried to focus on taking care of my mom, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there at the end of the path, staring at me with those hollow eyes. A few days later, I decided to do some research. It felt stupid, like chasing after a ghost story, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that path than I realized. I went to the local library, a small brick building that smelled of old paper and dust. I asked the librarian if there were any records of strange occurrences in the area, especially near the woods. She gave me a curious look, but pulled out a few old newspapers and historical records. As I flipped through the pages, something caught my eye. A small article from 1952 about a missing person. A man named Henry Coyle had disappeared while walking home from work. The last place he was seen was near the woods, not far from the shivering path. My heart raced as I read the article. The description of Henry matched the man I had seen. The trench coat, the hat, the dead eyes. I kept reading, desperate for more information, but the article ended with a simple, haunting sentence: he was never found. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Henry standing at the end of the path, waiting for me. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with questions. Why had I seen him? What did he want? The next morning, I decided to go back to the path. It was stupid, I know, but something inside me needed answers. I couldn't just leave it alone. I waited until the sun was high in the sky before heading out. I told myself that daylight would make everything less scary, less real. But as I stepped onto the path, that cold, creeping feeling returned. The trees seemed taller, darker, and the air was thick with silence. I walked slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept telling myself that I was imagining things, that there was no such thing as ghosts. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. Help me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, off the path. I wanted to turn around, to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Please, help me. I took a step toward the voice, my feet moving on their own. The trees seemed to close in around me as I left the path, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. The voice was clearer now, a woman's voice filled with fear. I'm lost. Please. I pushed through the underbrush, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. The voice was just ahead, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find the source. And then suddenly, the voice stopped. I was standing in a small clearing, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The air was colder here, and the ground was soft, like something had been buried beneath it. I shone my flashlight around, my hands shaking, but there was no one there. Just as I was about to turn back, I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel cold sweat running down my back. That's when I saw it. In the center of the clearing, the ground was disturbed, like something had been recently dug up. I crouched down, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and brushed away the loose dirt. What I found made my stomach turn. It was a bone, a human bone. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand. I had to get out of there. I turned and ran. Crashing through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I was back on the path, the familiar dirt trail stretching out before me. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I realized something horrifying. The path had changed. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but the trees were different. The air was colder, the shadows darker. I walked forward, my heart racing, but the more I walked, the less familiar everything became. And then I saw him again. Henry. He was standing at the far end of the path, just as he had before. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were others with him, shadowy figures barely visible in the dim light. They stood silently, watching me with those hollow eyes. I backed away, my pulse racing, but figures didn't move. They just stood there, waiting. And that's when I realized the horrible truth. The path didn't lead home anymore. It had taken me somewhere else, somewhere I didn't belong. I turned and ran, but no matter how far I went, the path stretched on and on, twisting and turning in ways it never had before. The trees seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. The figures were behind me now, following silently, their footsteps barely more than whispers on the wind. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and empty. I was trapped. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I stumbled through the woods, the path twisting and turning beneath my feet. The figures followed me, always just out of sight, always just out of sight, always just close enough for me to feel their presence. Eventually, I collapsed, my legs giving out beneath me. I lay there on the cold ground, gasping for breath, waiting for them to catch up. But they never did. When I opened my eyes, I was back at the entrance of the shivering path. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the dirt trail. The figures were gone, and the air was still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I haven't gone back to that path since. I don't even visit my hometown anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the voice again. Faint, just a whisper on the wind. Help me. And I know, deep down, that if I ever step foot on that path again, I won't come back. The Story 3, The Cabin in the Woods. They say some places are better left forgotten. That some roads, no matter how familiar, lead to things we're not meant to find. If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have laughed it off. But that was before the weekend at the cabin. That was before everything changed. Growing up, my family used to vacation in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. My dad had a cabin there, nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest neighbor. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom log cabin with no Wi-Fi, no cable, and no cell service. I always loved it for that reason. It was a place to unplug and unwind, to escape the chaos of city life and breathe in the crisp, clean air of the wilderness. But as I got older, life got in the way. College, work, relationships. I barely had time to visit anymore. Years went by, and the cabin fell into disrepair. Dad passed away when I was 25, and the cabin became a memory, a relic of a simpler time. That was, until my younger brother Jack suggested we fix it up one weekend. "We'll take a road trip, just like old times," he said over the phone. "Get away for a bit. We can clean up the place, make it feel like home again." I hesitated at first. The idea of returning to the cabin without Dad felt wrong, somehow, like we were trespassing on his memory. But Jack was persistent, and after some thought, I agreed. So, on a chilly autumn afternoon, Jack and I packed up the car and headed out to the mountains. The drive took about 3 hours, winding through small towns and thick forests that grew denser the farther we went. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the driveway. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered it, though a little worse for wear. The wooden steps creaked under our weight as we made our way to the front door, and the paint had started to peel from the sides. Still, it had a certain charm, feeling of nostalgia that warmed me from the inside. "We'll get this place back in shape in no time," Jack said with a grin as he unlocked the door. "This is gonna be great." The inside of the cabin was as rustic as ever. Dust coated the furniture, and the smell of musty wood filled the air. Jack and I spent the next few hours cleaning up, sweeping floors, dusting shelves, and making the place livable again. We found Dad's old tools in the shed and fixed a few broken chairs while the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving us in darkness. By the time we finished, it was late. The moonlight filtered through the trees outside, casting a soft glow over the cabin. Jack built a fire in the stone fireplace, and we sat down with beers in hand, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the room. "Man, I forgot how peaceful this place was," Jack said, leaning back in his chair. "No traffic, no noise, just quiet." I nodded, taking a sip of my drink. There was something comforting about the silence, but at the same time, it made me uneasy. Maybe it was just the fact that I hadn't been here in so long, or maybe it was the memories of Dad that lingered in every corner. As the fire began to die down, we decided to turn in for the night. Jack took the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, while I set up camp on the old couch in the living room. The warmth of the fire lulled me to sleep, and for a while, everything was peaceful. Until the knocking started. It was faint at first, barely more than a light tap on the front door. I thought I was dreaming, half awake and still groggy from sleep. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. I listened, holding my breath, but there was nothing. Just silence. I lay back down, telling myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe an animal scratching at the door. But as I closed my eyes, the knocking returned, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up again, my pulse quickening. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was outside. "Jack?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Did you hear that?" There was no response. I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. I made my way to Jack's room, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly, shining the light inside. The room was empty. Panic began to set in. Where had he gone? I hadn't heard him get up, and there was no sign of him in the cabin. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, nothing. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, my hand gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Whoever, or whatever, was at the door wasn't going away. I took a deep breath and made my way back to the front of the cabin. As I approached the door, I could see a faint shadow moving on the porch. My heart was racing, but I had to know. I had to see who, or what, was there. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling, and slowly pulled it open. There was no one there. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The porch was empty, the trees surrounding the cabin swaying gently in the breeze. I shone the flashlight around, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of forest. I was about to go back inside when I heard it, a voice. Faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me." It came from the woods, just beyond the tree line. "Help me," the voice repeated, softer this time, almost pleading. I shone the flashlight toward the trees, but the light only penetrated a few feet into the darkness. My gut told me to turn around, to go back inside and lock the door. But something, strange, inexplicable force, drew me forward. I took a few steps off the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was closer now, just ahead, beckoning me. "Please, help me." I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe it was the fear of leaving someone out there alone in the dark, or maybe it was just morbid curiosity. But I kept walking deeper into the woods, following the voice. The trees seemed to close in around me as I went, the branches overhead blocking out the moonlight. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my feet. Then, suddenly, the voice stopped. I froze, shining the flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing. Just darkness and silence. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and a chill ran down my spine. That's when I saw it. Standing just a few feet away, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, was a figure, It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, empty like black pits in its skull. I took a step back, my mind racing with fear, but the figure didn't move. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran for, but it felt like hours. The trees blurred past me, the branches scratching at my arms and face as I sprinted through the woods. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Eventually, I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked around, Jack was still gone. I searched the cabin from top to bottom, calling Jack's name over and over, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The next morning, I drove to the nearest town and called the local sheriff. A search party was organized, and for the next 3 days, we scoured the woods, but there was no trace of Jack. I told the sheriff about the figure I had seen, about the voice in the woods, but he just chalked it up to stress and lack of sleep. "It's not uncommon for people to imagine things in situations like this," he said. "The mind can play tricks on you." But I knew what I had seen. I knew Jack hadn't just disappeared. Something had taken him. A year passed, and I never stopped looking for answers. I visited the cabin several times, hoping that Jack would come back, hoping that I would find some clue, some explanation for what had happened. But every time I went, the woods seemed darker, more foreboding. And then, one night, it happened. I was sitting on the porch, the cool autumn air sending shivers down my spine. The cabin was silent, save for the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I had almost given up hope when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. My heart stopped. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Jack. But something was wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were hollow, empty. He didn't say a word, just stood there, staring at me with those dead black eyes. "Jack?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. He just stood there watching me. I took a step toward him, but as I did, a cold breeze swept through the cabin, and in an instant, Jack was gone, vanished like he had never been there at all. I don't know what happened to my brother that night in the woods. I don't know if he's still out there, trapped in some otherworldly place, or if what I saw was something else entirely. Thing that had taken his form. But I do know one thing. Some places are better left forgotten. And some roads lead to things we're not meant to find. The story 4. The Watcher at the Window. There's a story in my family that no one likes to talk about. They brush it off as an old wives' tale, a superstition that got out of hand. But I've seen enough now to know that some stories are real, and if you knew what I know, you wouldn't laugh either. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the most exciting thing that happens is the high school football game on Friday nights. My grandparents owned an old farmhouse about 15 minutes outside of town, a large, creaky building surrounded by fields that stretched out forever. It was a beautiful place during the day, but at night it felt different, like the darkness held something it didn't want you to see. I spent every summer at that farmhouse as a kid. My parents would drop me off, and I'd run around the fields, climb trees, and help my grandpa with the animals. I loved those summers until the year I turned 12. It was the last week of July, and the heat was relentless. The air was thick with humidity, and even the shade of the trees did little to cool you down. I remember that night clearly because it was the night everything changed. My grandparents and I were sitting in the living room after dinner, the windows open in a desperate attempt to let in a breeze. The cicadas were buzzing loudly outside, their droning sound filling the quiet. "Time for bed, kiddo," my grandpa said, standing up and stretching. I groaned, as 12-year-olds tend to do, but I knew better than to argue. My grandpa wasn't the kind of man you talked back to. I made my way upstairs to the guest room, which was really just a storage room with an old bed and a few boxes piled in the corners. The window in the room faced the fields, and you could see for miles. Normally, the sight of the moonlight reflecting off the corn was comforting, but that night something felt off. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if it was pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off, but as I lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't get comfortable. The room was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. It was faint, almost like it was coming from the distance, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was knocking. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the house was silent. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself. Maybe it was just the wind. But then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, closer, like it was coming from downstairs. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor as I crept toward the door. I didn't want to wake my grandparents. Grandpa would just tell me I was hearing things. But I knew what I heard. I made my way down the stairs, the old wood creaking under my weight. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. I hesitated at the bottom step, my heart racing, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back, to go back to bed and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But then I saw it. There, standing just outside the window, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized it was something else. It was tall and thin, with limbs that were too long, too thin, with limbs that were too long, too thin, like it had been stretched. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face. It didn't have a face, just smooth, blank skin where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at this thing as it stood there, motionless, just watching me with its empty, faceless head. And then it knocked again. Knock, knock, knock. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I sprinted back up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps, and dove into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child. I lay there, trembling my head like a child. I lay there trembling, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it could hear me. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually I must have fallen asleep, because when I woke up, it was morning. The sun was shining through the window, the birds were singing, and everything looked normal. But I knew what I had seen. I didn't dare tell my grandparents. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. The rest of the summer passed without incident, but the image of that thing stayed with me. It haunted my dreams, and I found myself avoiding the windows at night, terrified that I would see it again. Years passed, and I pushed the memory to the back of my mind. I moved away, went to college, got a job, started a life of my own. I didn't think about the farmhouse or that thing outside the window until last year. My grandfather passed away, and I went back to the farmhouse to help my grandmother with the arrangements. The house felt different without him there, emptier, quieter. I stayed in the guest room again, and the first night, everything seemed normal. But on the second night, as I lay there in the dark, the same feeling came back, that heaviness in the air, that suffocating silence. I lay there, my heart racing, and then I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up in bed, my chest tight with fear. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see it again, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I got out of bed and made my way to the window. I didn't want to, but something, some horrible, twisted curiosity, forced me to look. It was there, standing in the exact same spot, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. It hadn't changed at all. Still tall, still thin, still faceless. It didn't move, didn't knock again. It just stood there watching me, as if it was waiting for something. I backed away from the window, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I ran to my grandmother's room, bursting through the door, tears streaming down my face. "Grandma!" I cried, shaking her awake. "It's here! It's outside!" She sat up, her eyes wide with confusion. "What are you talking about?" The thing outside. It's here." She stared at me for a long moment, her face pale. And then, to my horror, she said something that chilled me to my core. "I was hoping you wouldn't see it again." I froze, my mind racing. You know about it?" She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't understand. "It's been here for as long as I can remember. Your grandfather knew about it too. We never talked about it because, well, what good would it do? It doesn't hurt you if you don't acknowledge it." "But what is it?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know," she said softly. "No one does. It's always been here, watching, waiting. Your father saw it once when he was a boy, but he never mentioned it again after that." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father had seen it, my grandfather, and they had never told me. "I thought maybe you wouldn't see it, not after all these years," my grandmother continued, her voice barely a whisper. "But once you do, it never really leaves." I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it standing there, faceless, watching me. I left the farmhouse the next day and haven't been back since. But it doesn't matter, because now, no matter where I go, I hear it, every night, just as I'm drifting off to sleep. Knock, knock, knock. It's waiting for me, and one day, I'm afraid, it's going to come inside. The Story 5, Whispers from the Forgotten Walls. I'd it started with a phone call I shouldn't have answered. The sun had already set, casting long shadows across my living room. I had just settled down with a book when the phone rang. It wasn't an unusual occurrence, but something about the way the ringtone echoed through the empty house that evening made my skin prickle. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the unknown number on the screen, before curiosity got the better of me. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, thick and suffocating. I almost hung up, thinking it was one of those spam calls when a voice crackled through. "You need to go to Redwood Asylum. Tonight." I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. The voice was raspy, distorted, like someone speaking through a bad connection. The name, though, sent a chill down my spine. Redwood Asylum was a place I hadn't thought about in years, a long, abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town, known for its dark history. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice shaky now. The line clicked dead. For a few minutes, I sat there, staring at my phone, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. I hadn't been to Redwood Asylum since I was a kid. It was a place we used to dare each other to visit on Halloween, the epitome of local ghost stories and urban legends. I hadn't ever gone inside, though. No one did. But now, decades later, a part of me itched to find out what lay behind its crumbling walls. It was a foolish thought. I knew that. But when I grabbed my keys and jacket, my body moved on autopilot. The drive was long and silent, save for the occasional rumble of my engine. Redwood Asylum sat at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt, like the trees themselves were watching me, judging my decision to come here alone. The road narrowed, and soon the jagged silhouette of the asylum came into view. It was worse than I remembered, its windows shattered, the roof sagging under years of decay, vines crawling up its sides as though nature was trying to reclaim it. I parked the car a short distance away, my heart racing as I stepped out into the cool night air. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I hesitated at the entrance. A large metal gate, rusted from time, stood partially open, inviting me in. The urge to turn back screamed at me, but something stronger. Curiosity, perhaps, kept my feet moving forward. Inside, the place was even more haunting. Broken tiles crunched beneath my boots, and the smell of mildew clung to the air. I took slow, measured steps, careful not to make too much noise. The hallways stretched endlessly, and the further I walked, the more the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. Faint moonlight streamed through cracks in the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight. The light flickered for a moment before holding steady, illuminating the worn-out hallway. There were remnants of the past scattered around. A wheelchair tipped on its side, crumpled papers littering the floor, old gurneys rusting in the corners. And then there were the doors. Dozens of them, lining the hallway like sentinels, guarding whatever secrets lay beyond. I passed a few without thinking much about them, but one in particular made me stop. It wasn't anything remarkable, just an ordinary heavy metal door like the others, but something about it drew me in. I reached for the handle, cold against my palm, and pushed. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside was a single chair, bolted to the floor, with leather straps hanging limply from its arms. The walls were covered in faded scratches, like someone had desperately tried to claw their way out. I felt my stomach churn, but it was the smell that got to me. A mix of old blood and something else, something rotten. As I stepped further into the room, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze. The voice was soft, broken, as though it hadn't been used in years. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively backed toward the door, my flashlight beam shaking in my trembling hand. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut. I spun around, lunging for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I tugged at the door with all my strength. It felt like something, or someone, was holding it closed from the other side. My breathing grew ragged, and in the silence that followed, I heard it again. "Help me." This time, the voice was closer, almost as if it were right behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight flickering as it scanned the room, but there was no one there, only the empty chair and the dark, oppressive walls. My mind raced. This wasn't possible. There was no one here. It had to be some kind of sick joke, a trick of the mind. But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Help me!" I pressed my back against the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. I dialed 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. Not here, not in this place. Just as I was about to lose all hope, the door creaked open. I didn't wait to see who, or what, had opened it. I bolted, racing down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of this godforsaken place, but something held me back. That voice. It sounded so real, so desperate, I couldn't just leave it behind, could I? I stopped, catching my breath. There had to be an explanation for all of this. Maybe it was just an echo of the past, a residual haunting. I'd read about things like that, voices trapped in time, repeating their final moments over and over again. But then why did it feel like it was calling to me specifically? Before I knew it, I found myself standing in front of another door. This one was different, heavier, with reinforced metal bars crisscrossing the front. A small window near the top was covered in dust and grime, but as I wiped it clean, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Inside was a figure, sitting in the corner of the room. It was too dark to make out any features, but I could tell it was human, or at least it had been. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was some twisted sense of obligation, or maybe I just needed to know. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, hunched over, its back to me. I stepped closer, my breath hitching in my throat. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, and the smell was worse than before. Decay, death, and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. As I got closer, the figure stirred. Slowly, it turned its head, and that's when I saw it. Its face was a grotesque mockery of humanity, twisted and contorted, with deep gouges where its eyes should have been. The skin hung loosely from its bones, rotting and blackened, and then it smiled, a sickening, twisted grin that stretched impossibly wide across its face. "I've been waiting for you," it rasped, its voice low and guttural. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. This couldn't be real. None of this could be real. But it was. The figure stood, its limbs creaking and cracking as it moved. It took a step toward me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My car was still there, sitting in the same spot I'd left it. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing standing behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty, desolate asylum looming in the darkness. I drove home in silence, my mind racing. What had I just seen? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, twisted, broken, and grinning. It's been a week now, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. The shadows in my house seem darker, and sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear it. Help me. But I know now. It was never asking for help. It was warning me. And now it's too late.